great honor to welcome you here tonight on such a cold evening for such a difficult topic. The topic announced is Bosnia. Can America, or the current American-led but Western peace plan, bring peace to Bosnia? We couldn't have a more extraordinary panel to help us reflect on this subject. Tonight's subjects billed more as a discussion than a debate, but there are some significant differences of opinion, I'm sure, among the panelists, and we're going to encourage vigorous discussion from the audience as well. Let me introduce the group briefly and suggest the topics to be discussed. Each of our panelists will get about 6 minutes, but fewer than 7, to discuss, among other things, 3 questions. First, why should Americans care? What are U.S. interests in Bosnia? And more broadly, what are the international community's interests in Bosnia? Secondly, the question that's put, can the current peace plan bring peace to Bosnia? Can this mission succeed? And third and finally, if they should find themselves in the U.S. Senate having to vote, as senators will have to vote this week, in favor or against the mission, how would they vote? To lead off, we have Bob Blackwell, a lecturer here at the school, who has developed and shared the school's programs for Russian generals and for Russian Duma members, who teaches a course on U.S. national interest, who has served in the National Security Council under President Bush, and previously under 3 previous presidents, and who's been a member of the faculty here for almost a decade. After Bob introduces the topic, Lieutenant General Bernie Traynor will speak. General Traynor is the director of the Kennedy School's National Security Program, which brings generals and admirals and other officers, particularly from the American military, to Harvard for periods from 2 weeks to a term. General Traynor served earlier as a distinguished Marine and also as a correspondent for the New York Times. After General Traynor, our third speaker is another member of the faculty of the Kennedy School, Shirley Williams. Shirley is the Public Service Professor of Electoral Politics. She is a member of the House of Lords. Sometimes when we want to tease her, we call her Baroness Williams, which is also one of her titles. But Shirley was one of the co-founders of the Social Democrats in Britain and has been an active political force in both domestic and foreign policy. And she'll bring to the panel an international perspective on what's otherwise a rather American-centric set of questions. Finally, our cleanup hitter is Jim Webb. Jim served earlier as Secretary of the U.S. Navy and Assistant Secretary of Defense at the Department of Defense. He was a fellow here at the Institute of Politics in the fall of 1992, and a number of you may have seen his op-ed in the New York Times week before last, raising some rather deep questions about the mission in Bosnia. So I think we've got a terrific panel. We also have the good fortune to have here tonight in the audience a number of people who have worked this problem for various governments. I see my friend John Sawyer, whose problem this was for the British government until he came to the Center for International Affairs in September, and a number of others. So we're going to encourage a lively debate. Let's start with Professor Blackwell.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for coming on this rather forbidding night. What I'd like to do in my 6 minutes or so is to remind you of President Clinton's justification for the American commitment of 20,000 troops to Bosnia. I do that because I take very seriously what he said to the American people in his televised speech on Tuesday, November 28th, and because I think it's useful for us to assess the quality of his arguments, to analyze them. Let me tell you that for context purposes, I support this deployment, and if I were in the Senate, I would vote for it. Let me remind you that the President began by saying that we should commit those American troops to Bosnia, both because of our values and our interests, and that the values and interests that we have require that we participate. In my judgment, the succeeding argument that he makes is much stronger on the values side than on the interest side. And indeed, with one exception, he does not return to the issue of our interests in the speech but once. He then goes on to say that our overall objective is to bring stability to Central Europe, a region of the world that is vital to our national interests. Now, when I pointed that phrase out to a German friend, that is to say that Bosnia was in Central Europe, my German friend said, "Did they move it?" Because, of course, Bosnia is not part of Central Europe as we've usually defined the phrase, and I assume the President has put it there in order to generate recollections of Germany, the Red Army in the center of Europe, and so forth. But he says at another point that Bosnia is in the heart of Europe. He had no maps when he gave his speech, but if Bosnia is in the heart of Europe, you wonder where the fingers and toes are. He then went on to make the following argument, that from Iraq to Haiti, from South Africa to Korea, from the Middle East to Northern Ireland, we have stood up for peace and freedom because it's in our interest to do so. So here is an argument by analogy, but one which doesn't say what is special about Bosnia that should take us there, even though I suppose it's more obvious why we should have perhaps vital interests in the Middle East and perhaps even Northern Ireland. He then goes on to recall the American decision to go to Europe twice in this century and ties that to his decision to send troops to Bosnia. That is to say, we entered World War I, we entered World War II, and therefore, with those decisions in mind, he says this is in that context. But of course, those decisions were both to forestall the victory of a hegemonic threat to Europe, a problem that I think even those who worry most about Greater Serbia do not believe is true today. Then there's a long section on the problem of what has happened in Bosnia and the atrocities, genocide, the concentration camps, the mass graves, and so forth. And here I think he's quite effective on tying American intervention to our values, not to our interests, but to our values. He then goes on to say that just a few weeks before he gave this speech, the Muslims, the Croats, and the Serbs came to Dayton and agreed, and now I'll quote, to put down their guns, to preserve Bosnia as a single state, to investigate and prosecute war criminals, to protect the human rights of all citizens, to try to build a peaceful democratic future. I would submit they agreed to no such thing, but that can come up in the discussion. And that leads to an issue which surely we'll want to hear you on, which is the question of the future of Bosnia and what we're there to do. And I'll just give you two broad possibilities. One is to stop the genocide by keeping the forces separated, and the other is to nation build. And there are three different points in the speech in which the President implies or says directly that we are there to help build Bosnian institutions, that is to say, to nation build. And of course, given the problems in Somalia and Haiti, that sets off alarm bells in some people's minds. His one argument about our interests has to do with this formulation. A conflict that has claimed so many victims could spread like poison throughout the region, eat away at Europe's stability, and erode our partnership with our European allies. This argument is, of course, a domino theory. That is to say, he implies that, despite what he said earlier, that there are no intrinsic vital interests of the United States in Bosnia, but that if we don't engage there, our interests will eventually be engaged because of dominoes. Just to say two things, mostly domino theories are exaggerated, and we think of Vietnam and other cases, but also there's no evidence that these dominoes would fall. Finally, let me just say, looking at the time and trying to stay in our time limit, he ends his speech in this way. In Bosnia, this terrible war has challenged our interests and troubled our souls. I think that the fact that his assertion that it has challenged our interests is not proven, in this speech at least. I think his assertion that it's troubled our souls is certainly true. Finally, I would say that this is a speech that I think was 18 minutes long, and the President in those 18 minutes used the word U.S. leadership or U.S. In the lead 17 times in 18 minutes. And I leave you with this question, which is American leadership an end in itself, or is it a means to accomplish other objectives? And if it's the latter, then what are those objectives? And if it's the former, could it be true that American leadership is necessary even on a fool's errand? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Bob. General Traynor.
Troubled our souls. I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. For the past 3 years, we've been treated to some atrocious coverage on television. Few understand the complexities of the situation in Bosnia. Few still identify with the geography and the plethora of unpronounceable names. Public dismay over daily reports for the last 3 years of atrocities in Bosnia have been offset, though, by powerful arguments that the United States should remain aloof from the human tragedy. Assertions are made that there are no good guys in the Balkans, that the carnage is simply a continuation of a 500-year-old vendetta, that the United States does not have a dog in the fight and should steer clear of it, that's a European problem to be solved by Europeans, and that we have no vital interests at stake, that it's a potential Somalia, or worse than that, another Vietnam. Most of those who make that argument consider themselves realists, and they go on to say the only time to send U.S. troops into harm's way is when our vital interests are at stake. Unfortunately, I think that argument is narrowly constructed and is a convenient excuse for isolationism. I'd maintain that a nation that is built on principle with respect for human dignity and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness cannot conduct foreign policy devoid of morality. We're the acknowledged world leader, and the world expects us to act on ethical grounds and not only in pursuit of narrow or selfish interests. But I would say wrong, too, are the humanitarians, as I would classify them, who believe that the United States has a moral obligation to weigh in whenever injustice occurs. I believe that while we do have certain moral responsibilities as the leader of the free world, there must be a reasonable prospect of success in whatever we do. In the Bosnian situation, I think we need a yardstick. We, as citizens, need a yardstick to measure whether or not this is something that the United States should be involved in. And I would suggest certain measures on that yardstick, certain criteria that, and you can think up your own, but these may be useful to you. I think we should consider supporting intervention in Bosnia if the situation is intolerable to our conscience, if alternatives to bring peace have been unsuccessful or have been exhausted, that intervention is not counter to broader national security interests. Notice, not necessarily in our vital interests, but not counter to our interests. That intervention is conducted under competent authority and leadership. Most importantly, that the objective of the intervention is achievable, that there are resources available to do the job, that the cost in lives and treasure is acceptable to the American people, and that by intervening we do not create a worse situation that currently exists. Now, I think it's clear that a year ago, few, if any, of these criteria could have been met. The fires of ethnic hatred were burning too hot, and none of the sides were in a mood to sit down and negotiate. The moral imperative to intervene may have been present, but the likelihood of success was very low. But something has happened within the past year, which I think allows the intervention to meet the criteria that I outlined, particularly the doability criteria. Number one, the NATO bombing took the starch out of the Serbs. The Croat offensive continued that operation. Sadly, the ethnic cleansing kind of created the demographic situation on the ground to the satisfaction of almost all of the parties, that they're willing now to accept basically the lines that currently exist. Fourthly, the exhaustion of the parties. They are tired. They are tired of war. And finally, the U.S. exercised its initiative as a leader. And we dragged the contesting parties to Dayton, kicking and screaming. Now, there's no doubt that the administration bullied the Serbs, Croats, and Muslims into an agreement that none of them likes. But it's an agreement that might bring a fragile peace to the region. The alternative is continued bloodshed. And having come this far, I think it would be unconscionable to turn our back on this prospect for success. It also, if we did so, would have a disastrous effect on our credibility and would show us not only to be morally bankrupt, but politically bankrupt as well. The U.S. claim on leadership, if we backed off what we brought forth in Dayton, would see that our leadership has been shredded, and I think the nation would be branded as cowardly. Whether or not this NATO intervention ultimately leads to a peaceful outcome is impossible to predict at this point, but with all sides at least willing to negotiate, the chances of enforcing the ceasefire as a precondition for peace have never been better, and the Dayton Accord provides the only hope for ending the carnage. Americans should not take counsel in their fear about body bags coming home. We have a professional military that's out there that's quite capable of taking care of itself. So we should not take counsel in fear for what we pledged to do in Bosnia. Rather, I think we should support the effort to make armed intervention a success. And it's not only the realistic thing to do, I think it's the right thing to do. And thank you.
Thank you. Shirley Williams will give us a broader perspective on this, including a European perspective, but maybe internationally as well.
Right. About 4 years ago, I was walking through a street in Baltimore, and I saw a shop front. It was a shop front which had in it a picture of the hanging of Polish military officers in Katyn Forest. And beside it, it had a picture of the opening up of Belsen. And underneath, beside the picture of a Polish military cap, it had the words in English and in Polish, "It must never happen again." It did happen again. Bosnia, in my view, is a story of incredible muddle, incredible self-deception, and incredible failure of leadership, and I exonerate not a single one of the major governments of the West from that statement. I also think it happens to offer us a great opportunity, and I'll explain why, and I'll come back to why. Let me first go back a bit, because it's easy to think that Bosnia was somehow dropped on our doorsteps like some very disagreeable present from Santa Claus, and it isn't like that at all. In 1991, the United States and her Western allies did their very best, almost all the way through that year, to try to pretend that Yugoslavia was not falling apart. They had good reasons for trying to pretend that. it was much more convenient to have Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia had somehow held a great many warring and historically hostile people together. But it became pretty plain by the end, towards the middle of 1991, that it was almost impossible to hold Yugoslavia together. One should say quite precisely that the American ambassador at that time and the British ambassador at that time still counseled that we should do our best to try to hold the place together. In the summer of 1991, Slovenia and Croatia sought independence, and they attempted to try to get agreement that they would be recognized, and it was a hard job to agree to that. One of the reasons why we should have been, I think, warned much earlier than we were was because the gradual breakup of Yugoslavia did not come without warning. As early as 1987, Slobodan Milosevic, the then president of Serbia and of Yugoslavia, had made it absolutely plain that he believed in a greater Serbia, that greater Serbia would cover a large part of what was subsequently called Bosnia and some part of what was subsequently called Croatia, and he said it all in writing. I've seen the so-called Belgrade document, and anybody who wants to see it can find it, and it's just as specific as Mein Kampf. It sets out exactly what were the ambitions for Greater Serbia of this particular person. As The Economist said last week, it's so strange that the man who was most responsible for starting the war now has the largest part in ending it. So the Western Allies were told what were the intentions and ambitions of Serbia at that time, and they pretended not to notice because it wasn't convenient to notice. And so when, in 1991, the rust bucket known as the Yugoslav Navy began to shell Dubrovnik, a completely unarmed and civilian city, and subsequently burnt down the beautiful city of Vukovar in November 1991, no Western attempt was made to stop them. I have to say this as strongly as I can. I believe this whole war could have ended then if the United States, Britain and France had decided that it should. And they took no such action, and that's why we cannot pretend that all this simply comes from outside and we're just being the good people who come in to clear it up. The war then spread, as we all know, and Slovenia, then Croatia, finally Bosnia were recognized. In the spring of 1992, in line with all the things we say about democratic values, a referendum with a clear majority of 2/3 voted in Bosnia for independence. It's perfectly true that the Serbs were the 1/3 that opposed, though some Serbs were among the 2/3 that supported it, but there can be no question of the correctness and rightness of that referendum in terms of the way in which it was conducted. We then, instead of defending Bosnia, and I make no bones about the fact that I think we should have defended Bosnia, Bosnia was a legitimate, recognized government, attacked by a neighboring power, Serbia, after recognition, and we pretended it was a civil war. It was not, at that time, a civil war. And this is where I hold Britain and France most responsible, for they consistently pretended it was a civil war and that they'd stepped in to keep the warring parties apart. Of course it's become a civil war because we've let it become a civil war, but let me say loudly and clearly that Bosnia was committed to the idea of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious and multi-racial state, the thing we're meant to believe in. I think Germany made a mistake in pressing for the recognition of Slovenia and Croatia without insisting that Croatia signed the Carrington agreements that required Croatia and the others to respect minorities. But it has to be said that the British and French eventually went along with that German request and did not block it or object to it. The United States subsequently came in and said that there ought to be NATO strikes and a lifting of the embargo, but its great weakness at that moment in 1993 and from then on was that it was never prepared to commit a single soldier. And it's no good lecturing your allies about lift and strike if you're not prepared to make any commitment yourself. So we have three cases, I believe, of inconsistent and self-deceiving policies. We now find ourselves with a brokered truce. The United States did a very important thing. It forced Croatia and Bosnia together into a federation neither of them likes. If ever there was an arranged marriage, or maybe a shotgun marriage, this is it. But it's been done because the United States, and I don't blame the United States for this, made it plain that the price of rearming Croatia was that Croatia would protect and help to support Bosnia. And there has been consistent rearming of Croatia against the embargo, and all of us know that to be true. It's probably the right thing to do, by the by, but it does make embargoes look a bit sickly. The final outcome of all this has been the brokered truce. It's a very fragile truce. It's as fragile as the snowflakes on the street outside, because it rests on two struts. One, the Bosnian-Croatian Federation. And most people who know Croatia believe that Mr. Tudjman is an opportunist who will take the chance to overthrow his Bosnian allies if everybody's not watching him very closely. He's always, and indeed publicly, made it plain that he believes a large part of what is now Bosnia should properly be part of a greater Croatia. He hasn't kidded about this. He made it plain to Vance and Owen. And finally, we've got the other strut, the Bosnian Serbs, who made it plain that they feel they've been betrayed by Milosevic and see no requirement to obey the peace treaty. The French have been given the thick end of the stick. They've been given the Sarajevo zone to protect and police, and that requires cleaning Bosnian Serbs out of all the suburbs which are now part of Bosnia, or else expecting them to say, we'll be good boys. And I'll believe that when I see it. So we've got a fragile truce, and we may as well, and I'll end by being extremely blunt. We can, of course, and will impose that truce. I think, well, Blackwell won't agree with much of what I've said, but on this we probably agree together, I think we have no option. It's got to the point where we've got to stop the war. We've got to stop the genocide that is going on, if we mean anything of what we say, and we've now got a peace and we'd better make it stand up. But it's a damned hard peace to make stand up. And my final thought is this. Anybody who believes that we can impose and entrench that peace in 1 year had better go outside and think again. You don't entrench peaces like that in 1 year. It's going to mean a much longer period of policing. It's going to mean the gradual takeover by civilian agencies. And here I finally end up by readdressing the Europeans, of which I'm one. We, the Europeans, had better get used to the idea, and that means Britain, France, Germany and Italy, that when the troops come home to the United States, as come home they will when the presidential election reaches election day, we've got to be ready to take over the policing, or we'll see a worse situation than we've got now. We'll see a brokered peace that breaks in the world's hands.
Jim Webb is our cleanup hitter for this first round. Jim?
I'd like to start by saying that there are a lot of people in this country who have concerns about the use of the American military in this area, and I am one of them, and I don't consider most of them to be isolationists either. I think that there are a lot of people in this country who have an internationalist view, who realize where the country is moving economically and culturally, and who also realize the limits of a military that's been downsized and have concerns about the exact uses to which it is put. And I would say in this particular situation, I have two strong concerns on that ground, one of which actually I started talking about during the 1980s in the Beirut situation and rather adamantly during the Persian Gulf War, and it has come to a head again here, and I see no one in the Senate asking us. We were asked to say how we would vote on this. If I were in the Senate right now, I think the first debate that I would ask for would be over presidential authority itself. We've watched presidential aspirates like Senator Dole and others who strongly have opposed the Bosnian policy in terms of American direct military involvement, like Senator McCain, give away at the outset the notion that the commander-in-chief provision of the Constitution gives the president the authority to send troops into an area like this. And I would argue that it does not. If you look at the history of the use of the commander-in-chief provision of the Constitution, Traditionally, the President can order troops into action if American lives are directly threatened, which is what President Jefferson did in the Tripoli Wars, if American troops are attacked, which has been done repeatedly over our history, if a treaty authorizes it, or if the Congress declares war. We saw in the Gulf War, President Bush put 400,000 troops in the middle of the desert in an area where we had no treaties, where American lives were not directly at risk, then went out to the international community and secured agreements, then went to the United Nations, and only after that did he present the issue to the American Congress. And President Clinton and his administration seem to have borrowed from that political strategy. NATO, in my view, in this situation is a fig leaf. The NATO alliance was created in 1949 as a defensive alliance against attack from the East. We have not had a vote in the Senate regarding the expansion of NATO's role since then, so the American people through the legislative process have not spoken on this, and I think it would be important for them to do so. The second problem that I see in this situation is that we really don't know how our military is going to be used. We have theoretical situations, but we don't know specifically what the reaction is going to be when these troops are put into place. And while on the one hand, I would say that it is salutary that we were able to broker some sort of an agreement, on the other hand, I would argue that that doesn't mean that we are bound to implement it on the backs of our own military. We're now seeing a situation where between 20 and 25,000 of the force that goes in there are supposed to be the United States military. This is a continuation, in my view, of what you might call military welfare to the Europeans, to our NATO allies. When I was Assistant Secretary of Defense, I did a lot of work in NATO for Secretary Weinberger. At that time, we had 216,000 Army soldiers alone in Germany alone, which was 65,000 more soldiers than Great Britain had worldwide in its entire army. That situation has been reduced now after the Gulf War, where we have approximately 65,000 soldiers in Germany. But if you look at how that is going to play in this situation, 25,000 in this area will probably get you 60,000 troops committed in one way or another, either naval forces offshore or logistical forces, particularly if this agreement goes on, or this obligation goes on for a long period of time, where you're going to have troops rotating in and out. So it essentially ties up the United States military positioned in Western Europe, and the principal function of our military in Western Europe should be as a maneuver force in case of external aggression or crises such as we saw in the Middle East. Another hesitation I have about this, when you think about brokering an agreement, is if parties really want peace, they will find peace. And if they don't want peace, they're not going to have peace. And when you put soldiers in the middle of that, it's very difficult to define what they're supposed to do. The other problem, which I would hope that presidential aspirants would bring to the table, but certainly we should ask for a debate on this as a nation, is an exact logic as to under what conditions the United States military should be used. If we had an agreement, and the last agreement to this effect was the Nixon Doctrine, articulated in 1969, which outlines specifically the circumstances under which the American military would be committed. If you had that kind of a logic, then we could have a debate that had a logic to it. If you don't have that kind of logic, what you have are these ad hoc, case-by-case situations that we've been going through ever since the mid-1980s, whether it's Beirut or Somalia or this situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. I think this is enough to get us started. Let me put a question or two to the panel to get the argument started. Then let me ask John Sawyer if you'll make a first comment or question, and then we're going to throw it open for general discussion. I think we've heard from our panelists how they would vote if each had a vote in the U.S. Senate. Very interesting. I think we've heard a little bit, but not enough, on whether the mission will succeed. In fact, I think that's been fairly faint about the success or failure. It's more that we think we might fail now, and a year later, at least a year will have passed, and maybe that's better than now. But I'd like to take us back even to the first principle, which is what interests does the U.S. have, what national interests in Bosnia? And I'll just put 2 points. First, Henry Kissinger, who's been attempting to understand this problem for some time, has a piece in Sunday's Washington Post, yesterday's Post, in which he asserts, number one, the U.S. has no inherent vital national interest in a unitary Bosnia or stability in Bosnia, or as Bob Blackwell has told us in President Clinton's word, stability in Bosnia wherever it is. Okay? But secondly, he says, President Clinton has created a national interest by virtue of his assertions and his leadership of the U.S. in the brokering of a peace agreement in which NATO is so firmly entangled. So his proposition is no inherent interest in Bosnia, but by virtue of actions that the Clinton administration has taken, both words that it's said and the role that it played in brokering the treaty, interests have been created. Now, it's those actions or their constitutional status that Jim Webb is bringing up for discussion. So that's one element. Second fact point. President Clinton was on 60 Minutes last night, and he argued that whatever interest the U.S. has in Bosnia and in the Bosnian mission lasts precisely 365 days, and not on the 366th day. So he says, and here's the quote, if we leave after a year and they decide they don't like the benefits of peace and they're going to start fighting again, that does not mean that NATO failed. It means we gave them a chance to make their peace and they blew it, close quote. So, comment. Please.
Briefly, on Kissinger's point, I at least have heard no credible argument that American vital or even important interests are engaged in the organization of the Bosnian state or its geographic boundaries. None. So I agree with Kissinger. I would, in methodological ways, put the issue slightly different. I don't think that because the President has repeated persistently our obligations toward that area, which is of no consequential interest to the United States, that it has become so. But it's certainly true that he's created expectations with our allies that, if they are not met, will cause a serious eruption in NATO and damage other national interests of the United States not having to do with Bosnia. So if we were not going to proceed with the deployment, we should have stopped short of the first day of the Wright-Patterson negotiations. On the second point, I myself agree with Shirley. I'll read what the President said about the length of time that U.S. forces will be in Bosnia. He said U.S. forces will maintain a ceasefire to prevent the war from accidentally starting again. This seems to me to be at least plausibly a realistic mission to interpose the U.S. and other military forces between the warring parties. But then, he goes on to say, these efforts in turn will help to create a secure environment so that the people of Bosnia can return to their homes. Many will not be able to return to their homes because there are other ethnic groups living in them. Vote in free elections. Much of Bosnia will not have free elections. And begin to rebuild their lives, one hopes. That those latter three tasks, of course, are nation building. They're not interposing between the forces. And with that nation building mission, he says, Our Joint Chiefs of Staff have concluded that this mission should and will take about 1 year. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. The notion that this bloodlust is going to be suppressed in a year is ridiculous, and one might also ask what expertise the Joint Chiefs of Staff can bring to the issue of free elections, people returning to their homes and building democratic institutions and so forth. So I agree with Shirley that, and disagree certainly with the President, about the 1 year timeline, because there's no hope, I think zero hope, that the warring factions can accept the benefits of peace in such a short period. Thank you.
Shirley?
3 quick points. First of all, it seems to me that I agree with what Bob has just said. It seems to me that given that the President made a pledge in 1993, some people here will remember it, that he would put in 20,000 American troops, either to broker the peace or to protect a British and French withdrawal. If he did not now carry that out, the credibility of the United States in NATO would be destroyed. That seems to me to be a very high consideration. Secondly, when you add to that the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base truce being brokered here in the United States, perceived by American television, watched by an American audience, it would be, together with the pledge, absolutely impossible for the United States to then walk away from the very peace it had brokered. The third and final point, greatly daring, is to say that while I have great respect for Henry Kissinger as an expert on the balance of power and the Cold War, I'm not altogether sure that he understands any better than the rest of us what the post-Cold War world looks like and what are the vital concerns of any country in it. But I would guess that those vital concerns certainly include trying to find answers to ethnic conflict, trying to find answers to genocide, and trying to find answers to the destruction of human rights. And if that's right, then Bosnia shouldn't be looked at as a little slice of geography, but rather as a symbol of those very things the West claims to be dedicated and committed to. And that makes it a major national interest.
Bernie, you want
Yes.
Yeah, please.
I think Kissinger, of course, is right that he says that we have no inherent vital interests in Bosnia, but that's taking a rather narrow view of things. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, there's nothing against our national interest becoming involved. I think one can make the broader case that obviously it's in our interest to have stability within the region. But that's a very difficult thing to hang your foreign policy on, although it's legitimate. It overlooks the moral aspect of it, which Shirley just alluded to. If this business of ethnic cleansing and genocide, if you will, is to become the mode of the post-Cold War world, then we do have a certain moral interest to get involved, providing what we do is doable. I would apply the doctrine of limited tears. You can't cry for everybody, but you certainly can cry for somebody where there is a moral imperative that you can do something about with a reasonable chance of success. And finally, I would take Kissinger's remark and would say that where you don't have any interest which would impel us to intervene, I think we would have our interest damaged at this point if we don't intervene.
Jim, you're persuaded?
Well, I would say certainly the situation in Bosnia is in the national interest of European nations. And if we're talking about a world where irredentist movements are going to become the focus of a lot of concern, there is no geographical area in the world where a collection of nations that are economically and militarily capable of assisting in a situation exist. So where the United States puts that on its scale of obligations shouldn't simply be weighed by the tragedy that is occurring. It should be weighed also by the ability of other nations to help deal with it. And eventually, the way that you should be defining national interest in a governmental system such as ours is by putting it to the people through their elected legislative representatives, and that hasn't been done. And to cede the issue before it's even debated, I think is terribly unwise.
Okay. Let me start here with John Sawyer, who's just come in September from Britain, where he was the assistant to Foreign Minister Hurd, and where he worked on these issues for some time, to put a comment and question, and then we're going to throw the floor open. Please, yes, secondly, and then we'll come to microphones. John?
Thank you, Professor Allison, for this unexpected privilege. Can I emphasize at the outset I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not on behalf of any government?
So with each of the members of the panel, I
Excellent. There's always a danger of these things. First of all, the Dayton Accord is enormously welcome. It owes a lot to a man whose name has hardly been mentioned in the American press, and that's Bob Frazier, who actually paved the way for this and tragically lost his life in the process of finding it. And I think his contribution needs to be recognized. It is enormously welcome to a European to see American troops landing in Tuzla Airport. It's important, it's reassuring that America is still able and willing to make this sort of commitment. It's also reassuring because the very presence of American troops on the ground will narrow that gap which has bedeviled the perceptions of the Bosnia problem between Europe and the United States over the last few years. I was very interested to read the New York Times this morning, which said that mandating American troops to arm and train the Bosnian forces would endanger Americans by compromising their neutrality. Well, there's been an argument raging across the Atlantic for 2 years as to whether you can keep peacekeepers on the ground and at the same time arm one of the sides of the conflict. We have been making the case which the New York Times so eloquently makes today for the last 2 or 3 years, and the New York Times has criticized us, demonized us as being wimps and appeasers. Well, it's very glad that the New York Times has changed its mind. Now, this makes a wider point, really, and that is that the presence of troops on the ground does bring home the real difficulties of doing anything there. There's been one element on the ground in Bosnia for the last 2 or 3 years have been Iranian mujahideen fighting on the side of the Bosnian government forces. They murdered in cold blood a British aid worker about 2 years ago. The PUN troops have always had the difficulty of avoiding these maverick elements in whatever they were trying to do. Even up until 2 months ago, the American administration had been very reluctant to apply pressure on the Bosnian government to do anything about these forces. But now that US troops are on the ground, it's now become the #1 top priority. It's very important. Better late than never. It's very important to get it right. So US troops are very welcome, and I'm very glad they're there. I mean, on the retrospect, I have some sympathy with Professor Williams's analysis. But the point was that in 1991, the Western Alliance unanimously and jointly took the decision that it could not put troops on the ground. There were all sorts of other things going on in the world at that time. Professor Blackwell will know them only too well, that argued against the great uncertainty of putting troops in. The UN Security Council adopted unanimously an arms embargo and agreed unanimously, I think, that certainly unanimously amongst the Western countries, that UN forces should be put on the ground to try and reduce the scale of the carnage. And it was reduced. 130,000 deaths a year in 1992, down to 3,000 in 1994. Still 3,000 too many, but a significant achievement of the UN forces there. One of the questions which has arisen is US leadership. And I'd like to ask the panel whether they don't think that this peace, this Dayton Accord, couldn't actually have been achieved 2 years ago. The Vance-Owen plan, produced by Cy Vance and David Owen, actually offered the Bosnian government a better deal than the Dayton Accord in several key respects. And I'll go through it if you like, but in several key respects it was a better deal. But that failed, not because the United States didn't take the lead on it. It's because the way in which events developed in 1991 and 1992, the Europeans had taken the lead, but the US did not support that European leadership. It tended to undercut the European leadership. Now, if we'd have done that on Haiti, we had not supported US policy on Haiti, but instead undercut it in any way, the reaction would have been visceral, and quite rightly too. And it's caused a lot of problems that, having taken the lead, the European leadership was undercut in the way that it was. So I would say that US leadership is not necessarily essential, but US does need to support those who do take the lead in this, and I welcome the panel's comments on that. I also agree very much with Professor Blackwell and Professor Williams and General Traynor that a civilian component of this is essential. You don't rebuild a society as broken and riven as Bosnia within the space of a year. But it's been a pretty difficult experience over the last few years. The British Defence Secretary has made clear that as a result of living through a divided NATO alliance for the last 3 years, that British troops' presence in Bosnia is now dependent on that of US troops. We go in together, we stick together when we're there, and we come out together. Now, this reveals a rather deep distrust, born of a quite, as I say, a bitter experience. Now, does the panel really think that the US Congress is going to delude itself into thinking that American troops can go there for a year, hold the peace, which it will be able to do for a year, and then hand the Bosnian baby back to the Europeans and start sniping again from the sidelines? Now, I think that Professor Williams is right in her analysis, but fundamentally wrong in her conclusion, in saying that the Europeans have to be prepared to carry this on. When you go into this sort of commitment, you've got to see it through, and the trust that's required in those on the ground has to be sustained, and that means those who go in staying in until the job is done.
A very good statement, and I think an issue painful to Americans, but well put. So,
I would just like to question the charge that the United States undercut the Europeans in Vance Owens. That may be true. We'll never know. But I would maintain that at that time there was no appetite on the part of any of the contestants to sit down and negotiate. The fires were burning too hot of ethnic hatred, and it was a combination of the fires burning out in this past year and the U.S. initiative to bring about Dayton that led to the compromise and to the protocol. But I think it's hard to prove that the United States undercut the initiatives that were taken in the past. I just don't think the situation was set for any sort of agreement and trade-off on the part of the contesting parties.
John, you want to make a quick reply?
Well, the same parties that signed up to the Dayton Accord signed up to the Vance Owen plan, namely Milosevic, Tudjman, and Izetbegovic, and they were the key people. The Bosnian Serbs were as unhappy with Vance Owen as they are unhappy with the Dayton Accord. At the time, the Bosnian Serbs were sitting on over 70% of the territory, but were being required to withdraw to 43%, not from 52% to 49% as Dayton required. There are 10 cantons rather than 3 ethnically based units, and the powers of the central government were far greater. But the key parties were willing to sign up for this. Now, I don't want to get into a deep analysis, but the Bosnian government were unhappy with it, and their unhappinesses were reinforced by the absence of support from Washington. It was a new administration. There were lots of reasons, but it was a painful learning curve.
Quick point from Bob Blackwell, and then
I was just going to agree with John. What changed in the calculation was the Clinton administration decided that an agreement was more important to it than any particular division of Bosnia on the map. And that was a big change from '93, where it had stronger opinions in some cases about what the map should look like than the combatants themselves. And that's quite a different approach than the one that was, I think, brilliantly, and I pick my words carefully, brilliantly followed by Dick Holbrooke and Warren Christopher at Wright-Patterson, which was essentially to say, which had been the European view for some time, whatever they can agree on is fine with us.
Shirley, a comment? And then...
One comment. I mean, I'm not, as you can already hear, a great supporter of the European governments, but there isn't any doubt that in 1993 the Bosnian government took great encouragement from what it regarded as the potential of American intervention on its behalf, and they were very unkeen on Vance-Owen, about which I know a certain amount, as you might suppose. I should also add to that I think personally that the Lifton strike, which was already being talked about at that time, gave the Bosnian government, I happen to have been strongly in favour of the Bosnian government, so I happen to have actually thought it was right. But the Lifton strike policy was one that gave, I think, a great deal of false encouragement to the Bosnian government at the time, and so I think it did undermine Vance-Owen. I think one cannot deny that. My only doubt is whether Vance-Owen could have worked without the Bosnian Serbs having lost a good deal of territory, and that's why I think the American brokering of the Croat Muslim Federation was probably essential to get finally this painful agreement at the end of the day.
Please, then another fellow from CFIA, but my memory is gone.
I'm Michael Liebal. I'm a fellow at the Center for International Affairs, and I was head of the Yugoslav desk in the German Foreign Ministry from 91 to 95. John Sawyers has, I think, very eloquently put the European position, and although we don't always agree on the past, I think I can subscribe fully to what he said, and I will try to put it maybe in a larger framework. Unfortunately, based on my own recollections, I also have to support what he said about the U.S. attitude towards the Vance-Owen plan. But I mean, the point really is that the United States was always part of the peace process, albeit sometimes in a negative way. I mean, it's not that the U.S., I think that's the point that John also was making, it's not that the U.S. was outside of the peace process. Its presence was always felt. And so, in a sense, the necessity of the American commitment now is a consequence that it in a way, it was never outside the process, even if it did not participate positively and constructively all the time. I want to address the issue of American interests and values, but let me say something before about the 1 year, because that worries me very much. When it's all what happens now is all very good, but this 1 year limit is just it becomes already a nightmare in my own mind. You know, what is going to happen after 1 year, and there's no certainty that the Europeans will take up the burden of the Americans if the Americans are going to leave. So this is really something which is a very, very serious issue. And I mean, one can only hope that maybe after 1 year, maybe the withdrawal will begin, and then, you know, it will go on and on and on and on, maybe, but maybe that's a way out. The point of the values and interests. Where is Bosnia, where is Yugoslavia located? From some of what was said at the panel, one had the feeling that it's really very much on the geographical periphery of Europe. But let's look at a map and then measure the distance between Milano and Zagreb, between Nizza and Zagreb, and between Munich and Zagreb, and I think you will come to quite surprising conclusions. And you will see also that basically the former Yugoslavia is a vital geographical link between Europe and the whole Mediterranean and the Middle East. So I think it's not a region which is peripheral, certainly to our interests, and I don't think it's also a region that is peripheral to American interests. It has been up to now peripheral in a political and economic sense, because it belongs to a region which is just looking for its way into Europe and into the Western community. One could argue from the American point of view that this is the political and economic periphery of Europe, and Europe should be able to deal with it because America has no vital interests in it. The past has shown, and we don't have to discuss it in detail, the Europeans were not able to deal with it. Let's just leave it at that. Let's not discuss it. Let's just leave it at that statement. They were not able, and in fact, their inability to deal with it successfully put an ever-increasing strain on the Western community as a whole. I mean, one has only to think about what I call the first and second Bihać crises, what the Srebrenica crisis, what the introduction of anti-aircraft missiles into Bosnia meant for the credibility of NATO. We were arriving at a situation where actually the Serb military, I think with the connivance of the Russian military, were really showing that NATO was becoming a paper tiger. So it was like a festering sort of became like a festering wound in the whole Western community. And then one could also argue that the task of bringing peace to former Yugoslavia is in a way part of the larger task of managing the consequences of the end of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. And I think this is a common task. It's not only a European task. We have been a sort of Atlantic community of fate. We have really created a historic community after 1945, and I think this community as a whole, and not the Europeans alone, have to manage the transition from communism to democracy in all Central and Eastern Europe. And I think it's in our common interest, because it would be a very serious blow to our interests and to our values if that transition failed and if we couldn't make it successful. So if we look at it from that point of view, I think everything speaks for long-term U.S. military and political engagement at the side of the Europeans, or vice versa, as you want to see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any disagreements, perhaps, if we have from the panel? Please.
I just say that while I accept without dispute that the future of the Balkans is a vital interest of Germany, that doesn't mean it's a vital interest of the United States. And it doesn't follow because one makes a judgment about the mileage from Tuzla to Munich that should involve the vital interests of a country on this side of the ocean. So that's the first point. On the second, I do think that it's important, and this is a point Jim Webb has made elsewhere, hasn't had a chance to make it yet tonight, to consider the possibility not just of the consequences of NATO success, but of the consequences of NATO failure. What would happen to this alliance if the kind of scenario we've described actually occurs? That is to say, in about 8 months, the Americans start pulling out to be sure that they can be out by the election, to get our relevant dates straight.
And that is not just a hypothetical. That's what the U.S. has announced that we're doing.
If the British then go with them, that will take the rest of the Europeans along as well. And what would be the effect on the alliance of this catastrophic failure in trying to stabilize the situation in Bosnia? I do not believe at that point that an argument along the lines of the president's on 60 Minutes that we gave these people who have been fighting for decades, if not centuries, 8 months to sort out their problems, and if they didn't want to do them then, pox on them, is going to shield NATO from the consequences of that failure.
It's kind of hard to make the argument that we're going in because we have interest there, and then all of a sudden, if they don't agree with us, we no longer have interest there, and back out. He shot himself in the foot
Jim?
with that.
I think that what I would hope that Europeans would understand when they look at the American debate on this, separating the diplomatic solutions and even the political obligations aside. How do you use the United States military? We're down from 2.1 million to about 1.5 million people on active duty right now. We have a little more than 100,000 in Europe. We've got almost 100,000 people stationed in Asia. Half of the United States Navy is outside the continental United States on any given day. You can't tie up the United States military in this type of a commitment, which maybe in the European sense, I mean, you can hear from the verbiage tonight how intensely the European people feel about this particular issue, but it's only one of many on the plate of the United States military. If something happens in the Middle East tonight, you know who's going to be asked to go? If something happens in the Indian Ocean, you know who's going to be asked to go. If the Korean Peninsula heats up, as it may, you know who's going to be there. The number one security threat, in my view, to the United States in terms of military security is the growing political, economic, and military strength of China, and the fact that we are not facing up on a day-to-day basis with an expansionist China. And by the way, that is in its own way an irredentist movement. When you look at the way that they claim lost territories, the provocations they're making toward Taiwan, the Spratlys, the Paracels, etc. To turn around and say that the United States should tie up 25, which will get you, as I said, probably 60,000 people for a long period of time in order to separate these warring factions in a situation that may or may not work is unrealistic.
The members of the panel can always say, I disagree, so Shirley, please.
Well, I was going to come off it.
Because I would like to encourage, actually, people to be as precise.
Okay. I mean, I'm not going to be too political, but we're supposed to be, the British are supposed to be sending 13,000 troops into Bosnia. We're a country a quarter the size of the United States. We sent troops to the Gulf. We've got troops in the Trucial sheikdoms. We've got troops in Egypt. We've got troops in Malaysia. We've got troops in Belize. We've got troops in Hong Kong. Where else do you want us to send troops? And I didn't think that, and Northern Ireland, we're trying to get them out. In my view, and incidentally, a majority don't want them to go until terrorism is over, so let's not kid ourselves about that one. But let's say quite bluntly that I always thought what armies were for was primarily in order to indulge in peacekeeping and protection. I didn't think they were for sitting at home in barracks. So why have armies if you're not going to do anything with them? And certainly don't lecture the Europeans at length about how feeble they've been in sitting home not sending their troops. We've lost troops in Bosnia, for God's sake, the French more than the British. So let's not chuck body bags at one another. It's not a very helpful thing to do.
Since the end of World War II, more than 100,000 Americans have died
and
in
a hell
wars
of a lot
in
of
Asia.
Brits too, but what's the point?
Count them.
We lost lots in Malaysia. I mean, there's no point in going on like this.
Okay, we're going to go to our audience. I appreciate very much having a chance to have the fellows from CFIA who've been working these problems as part of the discussion, and I think students in the school who will latch onto you after. We're now at the audience where short questions and shorter answers, and we're starting here. Please introduce yourself for the video.
My name is Veit Dengler. I'm from the Kennedy School, a graduate student from Austria. My question was about the skepticism Shirley Williams and Bob Blackwell had about the time frame of a year. It's obviously a political date, but nation building has a very bad name, obviously. After Somalia, everybody thinks of that analogy. And analogies tend to be bad, often. There's a class about this at the Kennedy School. But I will throw my own bad analogy out, which is countries that were exhausted after a long war, that were built on a foundation of prior authoritarian regimes, and that turned into successful, stable democratic states without the US or anybody else writing their constitutions or organizing their elections. And that, of course, is my own country, is Austria, and Germany for that matter. And Bosnia, too, is not in Africa, it's in Central Europe, and has a history of ethnicities living together. So my question is whether you're not underestimating the potential for nation rebuilding in this case, and whether 1 year might at least give a chance, if not for the whole of Bosnia to grow together, at least give a chance to the two constituent parts of it to organize themselves, and then start working on their inter-community relations.
Who would like to make a brief answer?
Well, I'll have a bash at just one part of the answer. I think that Veit is absolutely right. I mean, one has to start rebuilding civic society. One has to start rebuilding relationships between the different ethnic and religious groups in Bosnia. And I think it's not impossible because of the tradition that did exist in Bosnia of there being a genuine multi-ethnic, multiracial society. I mean, people forget how strong that was for a very long time. It's not a few years old, it's centuries old. So I agree with Veit about that, but my own feeling is, and this is where I probably disagree with my fellow countryman John a bit, I think it may well be right that it would be nice if the Americans stayed, but I think political forces will stop them doing so. I don't say that with any spirit of condemnation one by the other. I think the political forces will be terribly strong. And I think that President Clinton is paying the price of getting the Congress to let him go by having promised to bring the soldiers back. I think he might not have got it through if he hadn't made that promise. And I think it's a political fact that he's stuck with it. And so I think it's also a political fact that we in Europe have got to be stuck with the consequences of that. And that means we better think in this coming year about how we're going to maintain a military presence within which a civic structure can rebuild. I may be wrong, but I'd bet my friend John $100 to $1 that I'm right.
Okay. Please, Jim, introduce yourself as well.
My name is Jim Haskell. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School, and I'd like to ask the panel whether they would agree with this. I think it's both possible to agree with Ms. Williams and Mr. Webb. That is that there are interests in this post-Cold War world that we're not pursuing in terms of aligning ourselves with emerging democracies and the analogy this causes in Bosnia. But I have to agree more strongly with Mr. Webb and ask if this is also possible. This is the president, after all, who said in the election of 1992 that Mr. Bush's strategy was wrong, that he was going to be more involved in Bosnia. It was not until the massacre at Srebrenica that he actively got involved. There were reports that one of the reasons he did so was because it would be intolerable during this election year to see body bags come over CNN, or not body bags, but massacres continue on CNN. His one-year commitment is admittedly a political strategy. I, not as a supporter of the President, admittedly find this appalling that the President of the United States could commit troops on this basis, and therefore I agree completely with Mr. Webb. But I would like to know if that analysis is accepted by the rest of the panel members, and if you also accept the fact that Ms. Williams is right that actually maybe we should be involved, but in a much different way for many different reasons, because we have interests in other emerging parts of that world that could fall apart if Bosnia is left to its own devices.
So that's one for you to answer.
Jim, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I would agree with what you said, and particularly the way that you ended it. That I would not want to imply that I don't think we have interests in this area. I think that the way that we go about seeing our interest to their conclusions should be done in a different way. And again, as I said when I made my opening statement, I think the fact that we brokered this agreement does not mean that we should carry the preponderance of the military obligation in carrying it out. And we brokered the Camp David Accords. We didn't put a division, in between Egypt and Israel in order to carry it out. And I think it's quite appropriate that other countries in Europe bear a larger military load. The types of commitments that many of these countries are capable of performing with their military are vastly different than what we do with ours. We are particularly in the free world, we are the maneuver element strategically with our military. We can go to different places on immediate notice. That's how our military is structured. And to put it into this situation where we're going to bog down our troops for a long period of time and potentially take them away from other commitments, I don't think is the way to do it.
Okay. Please.
Good evening. I'm Jean-Céline Canin from the school. I'm from France. Nobody has spoken about casualties so far, or very, very little. The French have taken 54. The Brits have taken 21. What happens if the U.S. take 30? That's the question.
And not just what should happen, but what do you think would happen? Yes.
Yeah, I think that the enormous bickering and hesitation that there has been, either in Congress or among the public opinion, I think this is, to me, the greatest risk to the mission. This comes from within, not from without.
Okay. Brief statements from whoever wants. Bernie, I know you've spoken on this point.
Yeah.
So please.
There will be casualties. I suspect most of them are going to be vehicle accidents or people sliding off roads, bad roads out there. There will be mine casualties, and there probably will be some sniping casualties. There will probably be some incidents. There's not going to be any organized resistance against the sort of force that's in there. But implicit in your question is whether the American people have the stomach for taking casualties. And I would say that the record is rather clear from starting with our own Civil War that we can not only take casualties, but we can administer them. The issue is less the casualties than the conviction upon the part of the American people that the casualties are worth taking, that the cause in which the casualties are taking is a correct, a proper, and a noble one. Now, if the President is able to sell this to the American people will absorb whatever casualties are necessary. But they will do a cost-benefit analysis, particularly when you have a case where our interests are not clearly defined here. And if that cost-benefit analysis, as it was the case in Somalia, comes up on the side that it's not the benefits that we're getting is not worth the cost, then the people will lose heart. Now, I would say that the President, having made this commitment, I think he's doing it for more than political reasons, and I think the American people, with kind of an uneasy conscience over what they've seen over the past 3 years, are willing to support him. But he has a major problem cut out for himself in public diplomacy to make the case to the American people and to keep making the case so when those inevitable casualties do take place, that there isn't an outcry on the part of the public that this is not worth the price.
Anybody want to disagree, I guess, with just repeating?
Just add one comment. I think that, I very much respect what Bernie's said. I'd only add one thing to that. I think that the war in Vietnam left behind a bitter legacy of people feeling that casualties could be incurred for a purpose that they were not clear they really thought was right. And I think that both Britain and France, because they're post-imperial countries, are more used to the idea of soldiers dying, not specifically so much for a purpose as for the interests of their country. And so, in a way, public opinion sours less quickly in Britain and France when there are casualties than I think it does in America. And I don't say that as a criticism of America. In some ways, I think it's a very civilized attitude, the one that's in America, but I'm sure it's related in part to the Vietnam War.
Jim, you want a quick comment on this?
Yeah, just one other point on this, and it goes back to my opening statement about the constitutionality of this, and that is, if the way that this congressional vote is probably going to turn out, it's going to be essentially saying, all right, you have the constitutional authority, but we don't particularly agree with what you're doing. And if that's the way this vote turns out, then any time that casualties occur or negative events occur, then it's going to free up the entire Congress to criticize the operation. Whereas if it were the other way around, if this issue had been presented, and if the Congress had argued that they had the constitutional authority here, then you would have had a binding of the government, and these people would be forced, the elected representatives would be forced, those who voted for it, to more actively defend the policy. So it goes back again to this conundrum that I was talking about at the beginning. The Gulf War, it's a good example of that. For all of the success we now claim from the Gulf War, the polls before the Gulf War indicated that if we went over 1,000 casualties, the country was going to turn against it. 1,000 people dead. We were losing about 450 dead a week when I was in Vietnam as a Marine.
Yes.
My name is Tim Seawright, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. My question is primarily directed to Ms. Williams. If it is true that the primary American interest in Bosnia is the moral imperative with regard to genocide and ethnic cleansing, should we not also intervene in Rwanda and Sri Lanka?
Well, I think you probably partially misunderstood me, because my argument isn't just that the imperative is a moral one, but rather that what is happening in Bosnia is an example to other countries in that particular part of Europe who I think might readily move towards various forms of ethnic warfare. I actually personally believe that this area of Eastern Europe running into the Middle East is actually a very strategically sensitive one. It runs very close to areas like Iraq, Iran, and so on, and I think, therefore, we've already seen in vis-a-vis with the Kurds, the Macedonian-Greek near confrontation, the threat to Kosovo, and so on, that it could very rapidly sour into a much wider war. I was pretty hard on Britain and France earlier. I would say I think that they achieved one very important thing, which was to essentially contain the war within the former Yugoslavia. I think it could easily have spilt over, and personally I think it easily still could spill over, and therefore I envisage a widening which could eventually bring in Greece and even Turkey. And it's for those reasons as well as the moral reasons. I think the moral reasons mean you've got to bring humanitarian aid to bear, you've got to try and bring peacekeepers and peacemakers to bear, but the additional commitment of troops is because, as well as the imperative, moral imperative, there is this possibility of a much wider war, as has twice happened already in the case of Sarajevo in our parents' lifetimes and our grandparents' lifetimes.
Brief comment, Bob?
I think Tim's question is telling, and as is Shirley's answer. He asks, how do we avoid universalism, universal applications of these values that the President asks us to concentrate on? And I haven't heard a persuasive answer of how we avoid it. What's so special about, on the values side of this problem there? There are problems in Liberia, the southern Sudan, Rwanda, and so forth. So on the values side, if this is an issue of our values, what takes us to the Balkan Mountains and not to one of these other places? And it's certainly no secret that many in the third world say what takes us there is that there are white people, and that's why we go there. And we should say that criticism directly. On the interest side, I just have to say that my study of domino arguments, wider wars and so forth, shows that those are genuinely exaggerated. And I do myself resist the analogy of the two wars this century. This war is not a threat to our interests in the same way that the two other wars were. There's no hegemonic threat to the European continent, and that's what took us in to the First World War in 1916, and that's what took us into the Second World War after we were attacked by Japan and Hitler declared war on us. That Ernest May, our colleague at the Kennedy School, teaches us to be very careful about historical analogies. This is not a First World War. This is not a Second World War. It's ethnic cleansing.
May I pick up the challenge just to one sentence? My whole point about Kissinger was that the analogy is not with hegemonic threat. The analogy doesn't hold, but this area is precisely one that links up with the post-Cold War major threats, which are the threats of, in my view, of ethnic division and instability. So I take Bob's point, but it isn't the point I was trying to make.
But I'd like, if I may, getting to the specific issue there, I go back to the criteria that I outlined in my opening remarks to determine when you apply the doctrine of limited tiers. Why the Balkans and not Rwanda? Why the Balkans and not Tibet, where Chinese are doing terrible things? Have the criteria which brings you to a conclusion. And one of the things that will usually turn you off from going into a place like the Sudan is that it's not doable. In other words, the prospects of success are not very high. And I think a case can be made in this instance, setting aside the issues of morality and setting aside the issues of national interest. I think the prospects of success are probably pretty good at this particular point there. So applying the doctrine of limited tiers, we're not going to cry for Rwanda, we can't cry for Liberia or Sudan, but we can cry in this instance for the Balkans.
Yes. Tom Durant, physician at the Mass General, volunteer in Bosnia with the American Refugee Committee about 5 times, and the previous questioner gets to the issue of doability, again, limited tiers. Also volunteer in Cambodia and Rwanda, and I find the horror stories there no different than the Bosnian horror stories. The question of doability, unless there's some enforcement of international law, we're all signatories of the genocidal treaty, why was it not doable to put Pol Pot on trial for war crimes and capture him when we had 20,000 troops in Cambodia for 2 years? And why was Saddam Hussein not put on trial for war crimes and environmental crimes when we had all the troops that we had in Iraq, and he continues his genocide of the Kurds. That continues on, and the genocide of the Shiites. Why not? Why are these not doable?
You're the doability argument here, I think.
Let me break it up. First of all, having written a book on the Gulf War, we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and that's part of the thesis of the Generals' War. And I think it's a disgrace and a shame that when we were in a position to do so, we didn't do it, and we abandoned the Shiites, the very people that we had incited to riot, if you will, and then we abandoned them. But on the business of Pol Pot and Idi Amin, in the Pol Pot instance, we were coming to the end of a very distasteful engagement in Southeast Asia, that there wasn't any stomach for it. So realistically, that was outside of the decision-making process of an American president. But there's an element there that you bring up is, why have we allowed these things to happen inside of a state? Well, it goes back to the idea of sovereignty. The idea of absolute sovereignty, which grew out of Westphalia, where you don't interfere with what goes on inside the sovereign state of another. But just hear me out. Now, that has been changing. That has been changing dramatically ever since the end of World War II with the experiences of Hitler and the Holocaust. But it's not there yet. The Chinese still believe in absolute sovereignty. Most of the Latin or the Central American countries certainly do because of their unfortunate experience with us in the so-called banana wars. But, this is kind of evolutionary approach. Could a Pol Pot again do what he did? Could an Idi Amin again do what he did? Then I think, once again, we would apply the criteria as to whether you can go in and do something and it's going to work.
The question of sovereignty, the United Nations was in total control of Cambodia for 2 years prior to the election, spent $3 billion. And in terms of using a timetable as a criteria, and a perfect example of a failure, they were there for a year. As soon as the election was over, they disappeared, didn't train a police force, didn't eliminate the Khmer Rouge, and Cambodia is indeed a total state of chaos. Today, the Khmer Rouge are back in Western Cambodia. Could have been done. No sovereignty issue in UN.
I think a very telling question. Unfortunately, this is going to be the last question here because and I apologize for others that are up, but a short question, and then we'll have an answer, and then any last 1 minute point any members of the panel would like to make.
Sure.
Please.
This will be a short question to Mr. Webb, because I'd like to refer to statement that he made with regard to his concern about U.S. troops being bogged down in Bosnia because of requirements throughout the world and so forth. And as it relates to the President's 1 year period, isn't it really a response that the President made to Congress and to Senator Dole and so forth in terms of what's our exit strategy? Certainly, we just couldn't go there without any response to this issue. And I think that our lessons in Vietnam as well, I think the President is doing a good thing by identifying how long we're supposed to be there in this particular exercise. And as you mentioned, we've only got so many troops. We can't be there forever. So President Clinton, I think, responded to that issue. I'd like your response on that.
Well, assuming that troops are going to be sent in, which is, as you know, is something I have, particularly in this structure and the way that the administration has done this without having gone to Congress and defining national interest, et cetera, I have my own hesitations about. But assuming that troops are going to be put in, and if they're American troops tying up a sizable percentage of the United States deployed forces overseas, the type of mission, my point was the type of mission that this is being used for, which is something that you can sit down and plan in advance, and it's not a garrison force because there are threats and it's a semi-hostile environment, but it is the kind of thing that you can plan like a garrison force, that this is not the best use for the American military. That was really the point that I was making. But if they're going to be sent in, I think the type of mission that they would be put into, as much as I understand it, is something that could be done in a short period of time, unless they're going to put them in charge of rearming Bosnia and doing all these other things that some people in this country are proposing. They can go in, attempt to create a measure of stability, and then turn the mission over to countries that have militaries that are better suited for that type of role, and go back to the sorts of things that our military should be doing around the world.
I think he just responded to the exit strategy, and I think that's in that context.
If you're going to go in, then that's the best way to get out, in my view.
Okay, we're going to let the panel each have up to a minute of comment, but John, I'll give you my half minute, so briefly.
I just wanted to pick up one point. I agree entirely with what Professor Williams says about willingness to deploy forces. But I have a sneaky respect for what Mr. Webb was saying about unwillingness to deploy into Bosnia. The fact is that the military tasks that the American troops are going to be asked to undertake in Bosnia are quite within the capabilities militarily of European forces. The American forces are needed in order to lock the Bosnian parties into this political agreement. That is the whole nature of the history of this issue. And I'm afraid it's very unattractive for an American military man to have his troops exposed to risks for a primarily political purpose. That is the nature of this one, I'm afraid.
Okay. 1 minute final comments, please.
Quick minute. I very much endorse what John said. I also think there's something else to add, which is that the importance of the withdrawal of the Mujahideen from supporting the Bosnians shouldn't be underestimated. It really is a very important development, because the possibility of Mujahideen paramilitaries and irregulars in all that area of southern Europe is actually very dangerous in terms of the level of strategic risk. Secondly, I think I spoke of an opportunity earlier. Let me say that one of the things I had in mind there was the presence of Russian troops. It is a real opportunity to begin to engage the Russians in serious peacekeeping activities. They'll need to be retrained to do that, because that isn't their training either. But if we can involve them in that, it could be an extremely long step forward. And third and finally, I only want to say to Jim Webb that it is worth just reminding people that there will be 60,000 troops in Bosnia, of whom 2/3 will not be Americans. So I think we do need to keep this a bit in perspective. It isn't going to be an overwhelmingly American operation at the Gulf War. It's going to be an overwhelmingly European operation, with the Americans as 1/3 of the active troops on the ground.
Any other 1 minute from the panel, please?
Well, I think everybody's being entirely too pessimistic about this whole thing. You know, if you're set that we're going to fail, obviously failure will meet you in the face. But this is a doable sort of thing. You have the sides that are tired. They're seem to be willing to come to some sort of conclusion. The tasks of the military are doable. The specific military tasks are eminently doable. You are in the winter season, which is the non-campaigning season over there, so you're going to have a low level of military operations. And parallel to the military presence in fulfilling their tasks, you have the OSCE, which is going about the other political sort of and nation-building sort of operations. So I think this is a doable situation, and it's a right thing to be going in there from an interest standpoint, both in terms of political and also moral interest. Whether or not this can all be achieved within a year, I think at this particular point is irrelevant. Let's see what happens as we go down the line, and never say never. Never say that we're going to never leave the forces in there beyond a year.
I think it's been a good discussion, very good questions. I would just myself observe that, in my opinion, the critical variable here in what happens in the Balkans, widely defined in the next 2 to 3 years, is what the Americans do in the next year. And if we would begin our withdrawal in 6, 7, 8 months and complete it in a year, which in fact triggers the withdrawal of the European forces, then I think it's possible, even quite likely, there'll be a re-eruption of fighting, and the Mujahideen will be back. Thank you, Chairman.
Jim, we'll give you the last word.
Okay, I'll be brief. I hope somewhere out there is a constitutional scholar who is deeply interested in the notion of the powers of the commander-in-chief and under what circumstances a president should be able to commit military forces absent a treaty, an attack, or Americans directly at risk. I think that is the key issue for the United States military in the post-Cold War era, particularly in an era of irredentist movements and all of these horror stories coming out of smaller nations.
Well, I thank our panel for, I think, an enormously enlightening and penetrating discussion. I thank the members of the audience for making it a lively discussion. And on a cold evening, this is a painful topic, but I think we've all learned a lot. So thank you very much.